Welcome back. I'm thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker for the morning. And Dr. Shyam Ranganathan wrote this remarkable book that I picked up some years ago, I believe at an airport bookstore in India. And as I'm reading it, I'm really struck with the profundity of his psychological, but primarily philosophical approach to yoga traditions. And I wanted to note that he is the founder of a scholar practitioner initiative called Yoga Philosophy. And what he is focused on is the somewhat neglected aspect of moral philosophy that undergirds yoga theory and practice. And he wrote his dissertation on a wide-ranging analysis of yoga within the landscape of Husserl and Heidegger and Gadamer, and really the whole interpretive approach that we bring as we engage with what yoga offers. And it really made my heart soar, because having trained in philosophy both at Stony Brook University and at Fordham University, which values the humanistic, and many call it now the continental approach to philosophy, it was just so affirming to see this fine analysis that he presents. He's written extensively, and he draws also not only from Indian and European and American philosophical traditions, but Chinese traditions as well. And he is, like myself, an extended registered yoga therapy teacher at the 500-hour level, which means that he, like myself, can train yoga teachers. And he's also developed what is a gold registered yoga school, and currently is a member of the Department of Philosophy and the York Center for Asian Research at York University in Toronto, Canada. So we welcome and we're honored to bring into our presence Dr. Shyam Ranganathan.
I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Chappell for such a kind introduction. That was really very, very kind. And I'd like to thank all the organizers for setting this up. I'm really excited about the program. I was really thrilled with what I've seen and participated in so far. I'm going to share my, where did it go? I'm going to share my presentation. There we go. And so I'm going to start off. So the topic of my presentation is justice, ethics, and yoga. I am going to try and move a little briskly through the opening parts, and I'm just pulling up my clock so I keep track of time. I'm going to try and move a little briskly through the opening parts, because the opening parts, they set up what I hope is the main takeaway for this presentation, which is what yoga philosophy and the South Asian tradition of philosophies about meditation have to give us today. And I want to address this issue of appropriation. I believe it was suggested that I do so, and it's certainly on the list of things that I want to talk about. But here's the kind of the Twitter snippets. I'm going to be talking about activism, engagement, diversity, and appropriation within yogic spiritual circles. Now, one of the things that I've added to this presentation and analysis is that I want to situate this within a longer history of Western imperialism. I think a lot of discussions about these things are usually they're part of the problem because they don't situate our current problems within a historical context. And actually, I think thinking about things historically is very yogic. Thinking about the origins of our samskaras, the context in which we identify with certain experiences as definitive of us, but then those constrain us from growth and moving on. So I take this kind of historical approach, but just one small, my dissertation was actually on translation, and it was there that I really discovered the Yoga Sūtra. I was asked by chance to teach a yoga philosophy course to students at an Ayurveda school, and I couldn't stand any of the translations, so I started translating the Yoga Sūtra then while I was thinking about translation, and the Yoga Sūtra taught me so much. It was just one of these moments where my mind kind of exploded, and my dissertation did have a lot to say about well, it drew on continental philosophy, but I'm actually an analytic philosopher. It's kind of my nerdy side. and one of the things I've discovered is that's also why I love yoga. Yoga is all about breaking things apart. It's all about analyzing problems into components so they're no longer problems for you, right? You don't leave things simply as is. You have to investigate, deconstruct, and then in that process, you free yourselves from whatever was holding you back. And that is both a logical and a historical process. Both overlap. Okay, so here's the roadmap. I'm going to talk about methodology in studying yoga. Then I'm going to move on to appropriation, Western imperialism in the academy, and what I call philosophical appropriation. Then I'm going to move on to, so hopefully we'll be well into about the midway. I'll get to yoga and South Asian ethics. And then I want to conclude with some reflections on modern yoga. All right, so I'm going to go back to where I started. And if I was to really think about where my education in yoga began, it was before I started studying South Asia or Indology. It was when I was an undergraduate philosophy student. And my philosophy professors were overwhelmingly, well, none of them knew what yoga was, the tradition. They taught me philosophy by example. There's some things they explicitly taught me about. They explicitly taught me about logic. So I, like a lot of philosophy students, I took courses on logic, but they also taught me about how to engage in inquiry by example. And that was the beginning, I think, of my introduction to yoga. And then I learned about how not to study philosophy from my peers who were bad philosophy students. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them were pretty horrible. So that was kind of, these were these formative 19, 20, 21. I was pretty young relative to where I am now. And one of the first things that I learned that really had this kind of profound long-term effect on my thinking was logic. And so I'm going to talk about deductive reasoning because it's kind of a useful example. There are other versions, inductive and abductive, but the core of logic is that it doesn't have anything to do with the truth. So ordinarily we think there's this kind of myth that being reasonable is about knowing what the facts are or saying what's true. But logic isn't about that at all. So here is an example of two different kinds of arguments. Okay, and what I'm going to be exemplifying is this quality or merit of deductive arguments called validity. So a deductive argument is an argument where you have these reasons that support a conclusion, but they're good arguments if they're valid. So the first argument is an example of a valid argument. The moon is a squash. Squashes grow on vines, therefore the moon grows on a vine. Now, everything I said here is false. However, if the premises are true, if it really is true that the moon is a squash, and if it is true that squashes grow on vines, right? Well, maybe squashes grow on vines isn't false, but certainly the moon is a squash is false. But notice if both of those were true, then the conclusion would be true that the moon grows on a vine. Okay. Now, this is a reasonable argument, though it doesn't depend upon true claims and it doesn't come to a true conclusion. Now, consider the next option. Everything I say here is true, but it's nonsense. Donald Trump is POTUS in 2019. Justin Trudeau is PM of Canada in 2019. Therefore, Shyam Ranganathan is your presenter. Everything I say here is true, but this argument lacks an important quality, namely that if the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't have to be true. Okay, so validity is a pretty high threshold of, it's not simply that there has to be a connection between the conclusion and the premises, but that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So you can say a bunch of true things and be completely unreasonable. And you can say a bunch of false things and be completely reasonable. It took me a long time to really appreciate how revolutionary this is. It's not something that's emphasized in the Western tradition, where going back to Plato, reason was described as this search for the truth. Okay, so what this teaches us is that to engage in understanding philosophy, where you're trying to understand arguments and reasons, is not to try to understand things in terms of what you believe is true. Because what you believe is true is irrelevant to what's reasonable. Why is it irrelevant to what's reasonable? Because reason doesn't have anything to do with the truth. Okay, so, but my classmates who were bad philosophy students, they always tried to understand everything in terms of what they think is true. Okay, and so if they were reading Plato and Aristotle, they would try to understand Plato and Aristotle in terms of what they think is true, and get very frustrated when they couldn't make sense of it that way. So people who try to interpret, and that's the word for this attempt to understand things by way of what you take to be true. People who try to interpret have these fragile egos. They have fragile egos that expect the whole world to share their view, and then get frustrated when that simply doesn't work to understand others. Okay, and why won't it work to understand others? Well, we're different. We have different perspectives, and moreover, what's reasonable isn't reducible to how you see the world or what you think is true. All right. So there's this word I've kind of employed to talk about what's involved in using reason to understand philosophy. That's the technical idea on the slide. I'm going to paraphrase it now. So basically, you take reason and then you listen to someone and you try and extract, using deductive reasoning, a theory that then further entails functions as premises for the kinds of conclusions they make. If you know anything about the history of Western philosophy, Socrates is depicted as doing this kind of thing. He's not always very successful at it, but he tries to engage in conversation and then extract from what someone is saying a theory that's going to then produce the kinds of conclusions that they want to make. Now, this exercise of philosophical understanding involves drawing a distinction, a proper boundary between yourself and others. Okay, because you're not trying to understand what others are concluding in terms of what you think is true. You're simply trying to understand what their reasons are that get them to this conclusion. Now, one of the things, I mean, looking, hindsight is 2020, but one of the things I now appreciate is that using reason is a way to employ the yamas, right? Because when we're interested in the yamas, we don't start off with satya, truth. We start off with ahimsa. So we're not going to destroy someone else's perspective or argument. We're going to rather allow it to teach us something. And then we arrive at certain facts, the truth, that don't deprive other people of what's there, say like their perspective, allows an appropriate drawing of boundaries, brahmacharya. And then we walk away not having been encumbered, right? So this process of understanding by the yamas allows me not to interfere with what other people have to contribute to discussion. And moreover, if I'm going to employ reason this way to understand people, it's not going to be anachronistic. That is, I'm not going to be understanding them in terms of my historical context, because I'm not using my beliefs to understand what they have to say. Okay. However, if I fail to be reasonable, and I do end up using my beliefs to understand other people, then I'm going to destroy what they have to contribute, but it's going to be completely anachronistic. It's going to be based on my context and my perspective that I end up imposing on others. I actually think that this distinction now, once again, hindsight 2020, I look back on the Yoga Sūtra, the opening lines of the Yoga Sūtra, lines 2 to 4, I think potentially begins with the distinction between what it is to practice yoga, that within it implicitly has this idea of explication, right? Because when I'm explicating, when I'm rendering explicit reasons, I'm not allowing myself to be influenced psychologically by those thoughts. I'm simply investigating how they support certain conclusions. But when I interpret, I'm completely being influenced. I'm being influenced because I'm understanding everything in terms of my relationship to those thoughts, right? The contemporary term for that, we call that propositional attitudes, right? So you could have an attitude of believing a thought, of fearing a thought, of being angry at a thought, right? And these are all ways not to practice yoga, right? Because when we relate to thoughts via these attitudes, they have a psychological influence and a mental and physical influence on our well-being. But if we're able to employ logic and just investigate how thoughts support conclusions, we don't actually have to be influenced. Once again, hindsight 2020, I wish I kind of knew all of these things when I was much younger. It would have saved me a lot of frustration. But interpretation, trying to understand things in terms of your perspective, leads to what's now called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning and Kruger were two psychologists who did this interesting study of people who overestimate their capacities, their abilities. And they identified a problem when people reach erroneous conclusions and make unfortunate choices because of a lack of ability, but their incompetence robs them the ability to realize it. Okay. So if you interpret, if you try to understand everything from your perspective in terms of how you see the world, right, you're going to deprive yourself the capacity to reason, because reasoning isn't this explanation in terms of your perspective. But then you're going to come to erroneous conclusions, but because you're depriving yourself the opportunity to reason, you're not going to be in a position to realize your errors. Okay, so it's a bit tragic. If we, this same distinction plays out as I teach my students in class, plays out all the time in public discourse these days. Like, should I wear a mask, right? Some people are interested in the reasons that support a conclusion, right? So they're not particularly tied to how they see the world. They're rather interested in how evidence supports a conclusion. And then others just have these convictions. Like, I have a right not to wear a mask, or I have a right to do. And that's a basic methodological distinction with respect to how you engage with the material. So this is a cover of the Encyclopedia of Religious Ethics coming up through Wiley. I have a short paper in here called Modes of Interpretation, where I kind of summarize. It's a short paper, but it summarizes a lot of this research. And philosophy is one of those subjects that takes a long time because you're clearing out clutter, and the clutter can be very deceptive. So if I think back on what held me back from really appreciating the difference between a yogic approach to thinking, a logic-based approach, and this egocentric approach, is that there's this fallacy that conflates understanding from a perspective. We're all understanding from some perspective with understanding in terms of that perspective. These are not the same thing, right? So as long as I can draw the distinction between understanding from my perspective and understanding in terms of my perspective, I don't have to superimpose my view of the world on you when I'm trying to understand what you have to say. Okay, so one of the things I noticed was that while I was learning logic and I was learning how to reason. Sorry, I see some chat. I just want to make sure. I can't see the chat at the moment, but I assume Tina will tell me if there's a problem, or someone will tell me if there's a problem. Anyways, I was initially very pleased with my philosophy education, and then I started getting increasingly frustrated because I found that even though my philosophy instructors were willing to model this type of behavior where you think about the prospects in terms of logic, they would still have these weird boundaries on what they would be willing to consider, right? So their views would tend to be quite Eurocentric in bizarre ways. Their views would become anthropocentric. They would assume that when we're talking about, say, ethics or politics, we're just talking about humans. But if you were to employ logic, right, you would simply look at the different theories that contribute to controversial claims, and then you would understand the controversial claims in terms of what we can disagree about. and nobody would ever have to use their beliefs to delimit the conversation. So what I did, I was getting frustrated, so I decided that I would take up a degree in South Asian studies, because I thought, oh, well, I should broaden my horizon. And then it was weird. I thought I would be escaping Eurocentrism, and then I felt like I was jumping in the middle of it. It's a very peculiar experience. What characterized this experience is that I found that my philosophy professors, even though they didn't know anything about South Asian philosophy, they were willing to entertain, at least for the sake of discussion, arguments on the basis of theses that they didn't agree with. But when I went into South Asian studies, I found the opposite. Everybody was interested in entertaining non-Eurocentric South Asian material, but all the explanations had to be in terms of European perspectives and outlooks. So one of the ways that this manifested itself is in this widespread skepticism. I'm glad that it's less gripping now, but I still see it in lots of corners. A skepticism with respect to the reality of South Asian moral and political philosophy, right? So the standard view is that South Asian philosophers wrote on everything except for moral and political issues. Now, there is a word in South Asian philosophy that's everywhere, that if you understood as discussing the concept of ethics, the right or the good, you would see that South Asians were ubiquitously discussing moral and political issues, and that word is dharma. Okay, but and so if you were to explicate what I say now is you would understand this word as articulating various theories about the right or the good, and everybody would be disagreeing about it. But instead, if you ignore the universal, this is the more mature view. So I think now, looking back on things, there's really only one concept of dharma, and that concept of dharma is the right or the good. And what we have in South Asian philosophy are disagreeing theories on this concept. So the fact that South Asian philosophers are using the term dharma for various different ends is a function of the theories, the different theories that they are endorsing as they disagree about dharma. Okay, and so this was kind of the editorial outlook I took up when I was editing the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Indian Ethics. Contributions from lots of wonderful scholars there, and having this explicatory outlook allowed me to just encourage all the authors to focus on how the topic they were writing on contributed to a South Asian disagreement on dharma. And I think in a lot of ways this was successful. But now, why is this an important issue? Why should we understand South Asian philosophy as ubiquitously concerned with these moral and political issues? Well, one thing I think is worth noting, that the question of whether BIPOC folks have indigenous traditions of moral philosophy goes to the question of whether we see them as people who were smart enough to think about how to live and what to aim for, right? And if you depict them as lacking that tradition of reflection on those questions, you depict them as in need of political intervention because they never thought about how to live and what to aim for, right? And also, you depict them as naturally inclined to be colonized because they have no particular view on the matter, right? So at the time, so this is a cover of my first book, which was basically my MA thesis in South Asian Studies. And one of the things that I found just amazing was that people didn't seem to appreciate that they were just depicting South Asians as these naturally colonizable individuals with no particular view on whether that was an appropriate thing for them or not. It was also the first time, and to my knowledge, the first time someone tried to make the claim that there's really just one concept of dharma and everybody's disagreeing about it. The mechanisms by which I didn't have a great story as to what that disagreement looked like. It was that all had to be worked out, but that idea goes back to then. So how is it that the scholarly community was able to sustain this type of discourse about South Asia? So in time, I came up with this idea of orthodox indology, and I'm now happy to extend it to, happy in the sense of like it applies, but I'm a little miffed at it. orthodox yoga studies. Yoga studies is pretty new, but I see there's a way in which you could do yoga studies where it's simply an extension of what I call orthodox indology. And so authors who participate in orthodox indology interpret South Asian philosophy in terms of their outlook. And so one of the outcomes of this is they interpret uses of Dharma in the South Asian tradition in terms of their beliefs. So if you were to interpret South Asia, you would look at all the various uses of the word Dharma, and then in each case that South Asian philosophers use that word, you would replace it with what you would have said in that context. So this multiplies the meanings of Dharma insofar as your outlook and the outlook of the various South Asian thinkers you were studying diverge. But imagine, right, your friend comes over and she describes to you her trip and she talks about all the things that were good and all the things that were bad. If you were to simply just decide to replace every one of these claims with what you would have said in place, right, you would completely destroy the narrative, but it would also be a pretty hostile thing to do to your friend. And so I was just kind of floored that this was just ubiquitous common practice in South Asian studies, that people just thought that this is just how you do it. You just choose your views, your view of the world, and then you just replace South Asian claims about Dharma with what you would have said in that case. Okay. Now, of course, if the intuitions and perspectives that people use to do this are Eurocentric, then the only time South Asian philosophers are ever going to be understood as having some type of view on moral and political philosophy is when they agree with your Eurocentric perspective, right? And that's going to be unusual because that was just a different cultural tradition with a different set of concerns. And so this is a book. This is a very famous book by Gadamer that defends interpretation at length, and it makes the claim that prejudice is this kind of universal feature of reasoning. We can't escape it. And often I find defenders of orthodox indology, they sound like they're quoting chapter and verse from Gadamer. And one of the things that I'm often surprised is people don't appreciate that there's a history to this way of thinking about understanding, right? So you have this model of understanding that's European being elevated to the status of a universal constraint on what's possible for human beings, right? Which is just remarkable. The other weird thing I noticed was this kind of disciplinary colonialism, or this blurring of disciplinary interests, right? So what I observed was that instead of research and philosophy, you had massive attention being paid to philology, the study of texts, as though they were the same thing. If that was the case, then learning to be a doctor would be like, a medical doctor would be like learning about the history of medical texts, but they're not the same thing, right? So if you were interested in studying philosophy, you would just focus on that, and you wouldn't confuse that with philology. But I found that there was this kind of massive confusion of these kinds of things. And the final thing I noticed was this, well, I'm repeating what I said before, but this inclination to treat a lot of South Asian philosophy as a kind of proxy for Eurocentric intuitions. Okay, so I thought I was leaving South Asian studies. I felt actually quite exhausted. A 2-year master's in South Asian studies turned into a 5-year degree. I had to learn Sanskrit. I had to learn a lot of things, and it was also just kind of draining. I felt like I was being gaslit the whole time. When people are like, no, they weren't really interested in ethics. They were just using this one word in completely disconnected ways. So, in order to maintain that narrative, you'd have to depict South Asians as just absolutely irrational, that they would just decide one word would have a billion meanings for fun, right? Okay, so then I was like, I'm leaving. And then I went and did this dissertation in analytic and continental philosophy and translation. And this is not my book. It's an edited volume where I have a small paper that's a descendant of my dissertation, and they're called Context and Pragmatics. And I actually quote Patanjali in that paper. But anyways, it summarizes some of the findings of my dissertation where I thought I was leaving South Asian studies. What I discovered was that everybody in the Western tradition, and I mean everybody, assumed what I call the linguistic model of thought. The linguistic model of thought says that thought is the meaning of what you say. It's the meaning of your linguistic claims. And then all of a sudden, I felt like I was back in indology, because I started to appreciate that the kinds of things that indologists were inclined to do and assume in the explanation of the South Asian tradition were simply deductive consequences of basic assumptions in the Western tradition. And the basic assumption is that thought is linguistic meaning. Now, if you have that view, of course, you're going to confuse philology and linguistics with the study of philosophy, but you're also going to interpret, because insofar as if thought is the meaning of what you say, then to explain something is to explain it in terms of what you would say. And then once you're doing that, you're explaining everything in terms of your perspective. So this tradition creates from a really bad model of thought. That was one of the points of my dissertation. And it doesn't explain anything. It causes more problems than it solves. But it connects contemporary philosophy with ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks had this one idea of logos, which married thought, language, and reason. And the Western tradition is this unraveling of the political, moral and political implications of that way of looking at the world. Okay, so one of the things I decided is that, well, we need a new way to talk about the Western tradition, because I'm Western in the innocuous geographic sense of I was born in Canada. English is pretty much the only language I speak. Okay, my preferences, like I don't particularly enjoy doing, I come from a South Asian family. I don't particularly enjoy doing South Asian things all the time, right? There's a way in which I like watching, there's a cultural sense of just being innocuously Western. That's innocent. We shouldn't be fussed about that. But then there's this kind of really ominous and bad thing. And so I decided to use an italicized capital W that leans on the East to depict this West. So this is the tradition of Western imperialism, okay? And the underlying kernel, the way this works is the linguistic model of thought. Now, this model of thought is controversial in China, so you find it affirmed by Confucius, but disputed and disparaged by Taoists. In South Asia, nobody bought this. In fact, when people were thinking about theories of error, of how we make mistakes, then language comes into the picture. So there's a huge literature of conventional truth, or not absolute truth, but conventional misunderstood truth, or conventional truth that is not absolutely true, that relies upon linguistic representation as part of the explanation of how we get things wrong. But nobody thought that it was really the basic infrastructure of thinking in South Asia, but it's the main game in the Western tradition. Now, if you have this, right, I mentioned a bit of this, you will then think that to study South Asia is really, it's all about the cultural trappings. You worry about things like Sanskrit. That becomes the focus, not just a tool to learn to do philosophy, but like the end. And I think also it encourages a kind of disinterest in philosophy, right? You see this at the very start in the Western tradition. Socrates gets killed for not upholding social values, right? He's accused of corrupting the youth and promoting false gods. And that sets, and then immediately afterwards, Plato and Aristotle, they end up articulating philosophies of social conformity and groupthink. And then the Western tradition is largely this living not on the Socratic idea that, well, maybe we should all be explicating and having a disagreement about this, but what are the things that we all have to get behind in order to get along? That ends up being the main focus of the Western tradition. Okay, so I think one of the things that happens with the Western tradition is that it loses its way with respect to philosophy. It confuses Eurocentric ethnography with philosophy. It confuses the depiction and the description of these commitments of European culture as though it's philosophy. It also creates a whole bunch of other problems. One is, I think it's worth bringing up because race is something I think we have to come to terms with. I think it creates this peculiar phenomenon of white credibility privilege. White credibility privilege is the idea that it's the idea that like whatever you say, if you're white, it's got like some kind of default credibility because, and only insofar as it's based on the Eurocentric tradition, right? So it's going to be very easy for people of European descent to articulate their intuitions and for it to be given some type of hearing, right? But the moment your intuitions stray from the Eurocentric tradition, it becomes very problematic for you to be taken seriously. I think it results in anachronistic explanation because you're always explaining things in terms of how you see the world. Ancient South Asia gets explained in terms of like your contemporary commitments, right? So it's bizarrely anachronistic, anthropocentric. If thought is linguistic, then it basically we're just talking about humans, right? And also we're going to be constrained with the humans that we can interact with linguistically. Those are going to be the focus. And this leads into communitarianism, the idea that our moral and political duties are really just defined within our community, problematizes our relationship with people outside of our community, right? Colonialism, if the only way for me to understand how I can get along with other people is within a community, I have to force other people to be part of my community, right? Nationalism, if my language is central to what it is for me to understand myself, then my linguistic identity is going to be a basic political commitment. Proselytization, I have to make sure, this is another version of colonialism. I have to go out and make sure that they participate in my way of living. Race ends up being a downstream. The concept of race is relatively recent, about 400 or 500 years. It comes in after European colonialism takes a kind of goes a jump up, and Europeans had white chattel slaves, but then once they started colonizing brown and black folks in droves, they decided that they would prefer brown and black slaves. And then the concept of race gets created as a way to make sense of these political choices, and we're still living with those concepts today, right? And then religion. I think religion is the 1.0 of race, and race is the 2.0 of religion. So any alien tradition that can't be interpreted on the basis of the West, right, will then be depicted as both traditional and inexplicable, mysterious, beyond the realm of philosophy or rational explanation. And so you have this conversion of the ancient Roman idea of religio and superstitione into religion. And so, surprise, surprise, everything that counts as a religion is nothing that has roots in the European tradition, right? It always has roots outside. And then there's this weird kind of bait and switch. So the European tradition gets labeled philosophy. Everything else is religion or spirituality, but it's a scam, right? Because philosophy is not about your perspective or anybody's perspective. It's about employing logic to understand the possibilities. So I don't want to say too much of this. I'm talking too much on the kind of the preamble, so I better pick it up. But Hinduism is not so unusual, right? The only reason that Hinduism is a religion is because it's not Western, but it is weird because it was a term that was brought in to talk about everything indigenously South Asian, which is basically the whole history of philosophy within South Asia. So it creates this sense of some type of unified tradition. I say that the best analogy is fruit salad, right? Fruit salad is a collection of different pieces of fruit, but it doesn't follow that individual pieces of fruit are fruit salad, right? They could just be an orange or a grape. All right, now I'm getting to the punchline here. So if we were to just ignore the Western tradition and just realize that it's just interpretation creating moral and political distortion that we end up having to live with, and we just go back to these very basic skills of logic and understanding what the possibilities are, there are 4 basic ethical theories. Okay, and each basic ethical theory takes a different view on the right or the good. Okay, virtue ethics, consequentialism, deontology, and interestingly, yoga/bhakti ends up being a basic ethical theory on this list. Okay, and for me, this was one of those moments where I just was like, okay, what if I apply explication and I just think about the possibilities, right? And all of a sudden I realized that while the first 3 are very common theories in the Western tradition, and you find them in the Chinese too, yoga bhakti is absolutely not there in the Western tradition. if you look at Hinduism, if you understand Hinduism as just like, at least traditionally, not post-colonially, but pre-colonially, as just the disagreements of philosophy, you'll find all 4 ethical theories there too, and Yoga Bhakti. Okay, so I'm going to, I guess, skip to what I think is kind of the nuts and bolts of yoga as an ethical theory. Okay, so the main idea is that as an ethical theory, yoga is the practice of devotion to sovereignty. Okay, so what makes something into a yogic practice is that it plays a role in your own devotion to sovereignty. Okay, and sovereignty, and all people, what it is to be a person, is to be the kind of thing with an interest in your own sovereignty. Okay, now I think on the Yoga Sūtra, both Īśvara as a person and ourselves as people are abstractions from our lives. And we're abstractions that we have to contemplate in order to evaluate, make these choices, these conscious choices with respect to how to live. Right? Now, why is conscious choosing so important? Is because when we don't take responsibility for our relationship to our thoughts and feelings, our sovereignty is compromised. We end up being influenced by our thoughts and feelings as opposed to controlling them. And so as part of our own devotion to sovereignty, right, we engage in various yogic practices that help us regain this freedom and control in our life. Now, if a person's the kind of thing that has an interest in their own sovereignty, then non-human animals are people, and so is the earth. And if you know something about South Asia, that's the way they saw it, right? They didn't draw these kinds of boundaries between humans and non-human animals, right? They were quite willing and to acknowledge the planets, the sun, etc., as people, because there's a way to understand them as things that thrive if they get to choose themselves, right? And I think for us today, with environmental catastrophe, understanding Bhumi this way, the earth this way, as someone who thrives, if we give her the space she deserves to thrive, is something that is certainly absent from the Western tradition, but something we're having to come to terms with now. All right, now, Īśvara, sovereignty. What is it? I think in book one of the Yoga Sūtra, there's a description of Īśvara, and there's a bunch of traits, and they kind of divide into 2 different groups. Okay, so one set of traits of Īśvara is that it's not afflicted. It doesn't have afflicted activity. It's not afflicted, so it's able to govern itself, but it's also not constrained by the past karma, past stores of karma. So it's unconservative. So then when we go to book 2 of the Yoga Sūtra, Patanjali says, well, there's Kriya Yoga, yoga and practice. You start off as Īśvara praṇidhāna is this kind of overarching idea. And then instead of talking about what Īśvara is, there's 2 other practices that are recommended, which are, it seems to me, ways of practicing these 2 different kinds of traits of sovereignty. So tapas is your freedom from your own past, right, where you push your own boundaries. And Svādhyāya, right, where you own your own choices, right, you own your own connection to your Ishta Devata. And as studying is always control in yoga, it's always about taking charge. So to study yourself, to self-control. So basically then we start off with this basic idea of devotion to sovereignty, and then yoga says, well, what does this look like? It means that you have to make this a reality in your own life by challenging yourself to be free of your own past, and by owning your own choices and values. Okay, I think it's a really important part of the ethical theory of yoga that Īśvara is an abstraction and not proprietary. So when I'm devoted to Īśvara, I'm not devoted to me, I'm devoted to sovereignty. But when I understand why is it important that it's not me, it's a normative idea. If it was just me, then I could simply treat myself as perfect as is. There would be no grounds for tapas, no grounds for Svādhyāya. But if I understand Īśvara as an ideal of right choosing, then it's not proprietary and I don't own it. And in being devoted to it, I realize that, well, that's something we have in common. All people, what they share, even though we're all radically different as individuals, we share an interest in our own sovereignty. And so Īśvara praṇidhāna, then, I think, if you're really getting it right, involves this commitment to others, which is why you start off with the yamas, right? Before you even get into the main part of Kriya Yoga that's repeated in the niyamas, you have to set up a social environment that makes it safe for people to have their personal boundaries respected, right? And their needs respected. And that's a great duty that everybody's supposed to take on. It's not just for the yogic practitioner. Potentially pretty clear. Everybody, no matter what context, has to take this on. Then what happens when you meet with people who oppose yogic practice, right? Because they advocate himsa, violence, something like that. Well, potentially discusses this too, right? In the face of opposition, you have to meet himsa with ahimsa. You have to double down on the practice of ahimsa, because the practice of ahimsa is in yoga a disruption of harm. And what that does is it causes your opponent to renounce their hostility. One of the things I noticed, I was reading this, and I didn't actually know very much about Gandhi at all. I mean, aside from like I watched the movie and I know about Gandhi in the way everybody knows, but I wasn't a Gandhi scholar. But I was like, hey, this is direct action, right? This idea that if people are doing violent things, you double down in the practice of ahimsa to get to force a transformation on them, their own moral transformation, so that they end up moving away from their own violent past, right? That's exactly the blueprint of Gandhi's Satyagraha. And then, of course, it ends up being very influential on Martin Luther King. And then you can think about all the descendant movements like Black Lives Matter and another direct action everywhere, which is does the same for non-human animals, right? Now, it turns out, of course, that Gandhi was hugely influenced by the Yoga Sūtra. He quotes in the collected works of Gandhi, he cites Bhagwan Patanjali extensively for the source of his political theorizing. So when we think about the influence of yoga ethics on the world, it's massive, right? What we're seeing today in terms of the implementation of direct action, nonviolent direct action in the face of oppressive tactics is a genealogical descendant of the Yoga Sūtra. All right, now in the Yoga Sūtra, towards the end, right? How do you finalize or perfect your own yogic practice of kaivalya, where you are no longer influenced? It's all a matter of your own sovereignty. You have to undergo the Dharma Mega Samadhi, which is the ethical cleansing. Right? And the ethical cleansing gets you to transcend all selfishness in every context. Okay, and the selfishness in every context, I think, is this idea that, in a way, that everything is about you, right? If you can get over that, paradoxically, then you've taken responsibility for everything, right? When you understand that there are different people with their own histories and their own challenges, then you are able to relate to them in a responsible and positive way, right? And that has real social impact. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Okay, so Yoga Bhakti is a basic ethical theory because it says that so the right leads to the good. It's the opposite of virtue ethics, which says that a good character leads to right choices. So the right is Īśvara, and so when being devoted to sovereignty, we produce the good life. That's the kind of kernel of yoga as an ethical theory. Now, of course, yoga, the philosophy, is not the only view on what yoga is. And so I've kind of just made up this phrase, non-yoga yoga, right? So, we talk about Buddhist yoga or Jain yoga, etc. So how are we supposed to understand all of these variations? And I think if we go back to appreciating that South Asia is this big disagreement about Dharma, about the right or the good, then we see that a lot of these other philosophies, they have different views about the relationship between the right and the good. And depending upon that, they sometimes subordinate some of the practices that would be essential to yoga, the philosophy, as a kind of subordinate practice. But in order to understand what they're about, you have to understand their account of Dharma, right? So Yogacara Buddhism seems to me to be a great example. It's not an accident they call themselves Yogacara. They mean to tell you that like yoga's important or central to their story. But in order to understand how they're Buddhist, you have to understand the Buddhist story of Dharma, right? So you need to start off with and the same with Jain yoga, right? You have to understand the Jain story about Dharma. And then once you've done that, you can understand innovations like, well, explicit innovations like Umasvati, but also earlier Jain meditational practices as subordinate to these views on Dharma. So I don't want to say that there's a definitive list of non-yoga yoga, right? But I think what's interesting about these South Asian options is that they were really upfront about their philosophical disagreements. And this, I think, is really important for us today when we're considering appropriation. Okay. Now, in modern yoga, right, what is that? Well, I think one way to understand it, if it's going to be a continuation of the South Asian tradition, is you're going to understand it as an engagement in practice in the frame of yoga or some alternate theory of Dharma that makes room for yogic practices. Okay, so insofar as we are continuing on in this tradition today in the modern context, I think that's what yoga looks like. Now there is a kind of an orthodox indology approach to this, where we just interpret what yoga means in terms of what we would say, right? And on this story, there's no unity or a rational explanation for all the things that are called yoga. They're just various different things, and we describe them in terms of what we would say, right? But I mean, for the same reason that I would suggest that we shouldn't do that with Dharma, I think we shouldn't do that with yoga either. We should rather think about the philosophical disagreements at play in the South Asian tradition, and then understand different ways that yoga could participate in those disagreements, right? And that, I think, is far less anachronistic. It's actually responding to what we're actually being responsible to the tradition. All right. So, one of the things that people often ask me to talk about, well, maybe just in the last 6 months, because it's the thing on people's mind, but like, what about activism? What about engagement in social issues? And the thing I want to say is just go back to the Yoga Sūtra. This is not an innovation, right? There's nothing that's relevant to the challenges that we are facing today that were not already philosophically addressed in the Yoga Sutra. So it's not like we have to figure out how to apply yoga to contemporary challenges. We just have to practice yoga. We just have to unfold the full implications of this radical theory that says, well, everybody's sovereignty, and you have to start off with ahimsa, right? So if you could just go back to these basics, it's radical and transformative impact. Now, diversity, of course, gets addressed here because sovereignty is the ideal of diversity. Each one of us sovereign. That means each quirky one of us, right? We're not all the same thing, but we all have an interest in it, calling the shots ourselves, right, for our own life. So if we can embrace that aspect of yoga, then diversity is taken care of, right? And activism is just what it's already there. Book 2, 33 to 35. Activism is just what yoga looks like in the face of opposition, which is all the time. All right, now I want to skip that. All right, so with respect to appropriation, okay, I want to just finish with some thoughts on that. I think that appropriation is really encouraged by the West, as in this imperial tradition, where we think that credibility is about explaining things in terms of this Eurocentric tradition, right? Now, the fact that we live in a westernized world means that people who are who have these people who have these cultural intuitions, these Eurocentric intuitions, are going to be given a competitive advantage because the system is set up to think that that's what's important, right? So, so we need to kind of, if we can simply get back to this more responsible engagement with yoga as part of an ancient tradition, we would simply cut the root of that contemporary appropriation away. So, and we would also solve these problems of discrimination, right? We wouldn't see the marginalization of non-white people in yoga education and yoga participation, because Western heritage and Western intuitions wouldn't be a criterion of who we think is worth taking seriously. We would rather prefer scholars and people who've spent time studying, right? And that ends up being the criterion, right? So it wouldn't just be that all of a sudden we start listening to brown folks. That would be weird too, right? Like the point would be that we take engagement with yoga as the criterion of expertise and authority, not cultural insight. So one of the things that I find myself wrestling with is, and I see this happen to me on Instagram, is a very weird way to, well, I mean, it's public philosophy these days, but like I'll post something from the Yoga Sūtra and I'll provide my account of what it says, and then I'll get someone who will tell me that I'm wrong. And then I will respond to them, and then they'll say something like, that's just your opinion, or everybody should be free to have their opinion, or something like that. Right? It's just whatever, you know, at the end of the day, it just means whatever I feel like it means. Several weird things about this. A, if that was the case, why did you bother correcting me, right? Because I should have been free to like just say what I thought, but you felt like I had to be corrected, so that was weird. But secondly, I think this idea that it's just all a matter of opinion is nonsense, right? There's something to study there, and you can get it right or you can get it wrong. I think the reason why people want to say it's all opinion is that they don't actually want to responsibly deal with this material, right? They just want to have the moment of, I don't know, their 5 minutes of fame or something to say they know something about yoga. So, but that I think has a lot to do with the West. Finally, I think perhaps the last thing I guess the last bad thing I want to mention, and then I hopefully will end on something positive, is what I call liberalism with dance moves. So I think this is kind of the dominant form of yoga as it's marketed and taught, right? So it assumes liberalism. So liberalism is a philosophy of Hobbes, Locke, Kant, Mill. The idea is that, well, persons are human, an agent is defined by their preferences, which are beyond criticism. They're just arbitrary. Everybody has their own list of preferences, so you can't criticize any of them. And anything that's consistent with these is permissible. So there's no such thing as yogic moral or political commitments. And these people object when you point out that, no, there really are yogic moral and political commitments. They get upset, right? Now, the question I ask myself, well, how is this different than, say, Jains and Buddhists doing yoga, right? Isn't that appropriation? And no, it's not. Because when Jains and Buddhists decide to do it, they're upfront about what they're disagreeing about, right? So they're not denying that there's a controversy or that we could take different perspectives on this, right? But liberalism with dance moves is all about denying that there's philosophically something interesting here to talk about, because the moment you do, you seem to be transgressing this idea that it's just all a matter of whatever you want and whatever you believe. Right. So when I look at the South Asian tradition and this freedom that they gave each other to disagree about everything, none of that is appropriative. When I think about the contemporary Western context where there's this, you're forbidden to engage in moral and political discourse in philosophical criticism, right? Because that just just pierces this delusion that somehow it's just all about the way I see the world, right? That is appropriation. Okay, so it's not up front. So I guess in closing, I have like 10 seconds. But in closing, I want to say that if we're, for any of the moral political issues we're concerned with today, and all the themes that Professor Chappell talked about with respect to there's symmetry and relationship between ourselves and the wider cosmos we're in, if we go back to these basics of yoga philosophy, we find that they give us the tools to deal with all of these issues, because the basic idea of yoga is that, right, we're all different and we share interests, right? So how is it that we can live our life successfully that way? And that's, I think, what Īśvara praṇidhāna really comes down to, right? Like, well, if we allow sovereignty to be the basic idea, then we can give each other the room we need. Everybody needs to be sovereign, including ourselves. So anyways, thank you so much. I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you, Dr. Shyam, for joining us and for your incredible talk this morning.
Thank you.
There's a quote that says, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth to listen twice as much as we speak. And I'm inspired by your call for yoga practitioners to practice activism, deep listening, true empathy, and to check our pervasive nature of our inner biases and judgments in language from a yoga philosophy and logical framework. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would like to open up the question and answer session now. I see we have a couple of questions coming into the chat. We have here, let's see, Susan Newcomb, who asks, could you talk a bit more about how you think about translation versus interpretation?
Yeah, so I don't think these are the same thing. I think it's a old view in the Western tradition that Heidegger is famous, apparently said every translation is an interpretation. An interpretation is an explanation in terms of what you believe. A translation can't be that. Otherwise, it's just there wouldn't be a difference between a translation and like your novel, right? Or your autobiography. So anyways, that was what my dissertation was on. I learned a lot from thinking about translation in terms of yoga. So I'll just say this and leave it at that. And I'm happy to, in the chat, to leave some references. Best practices in translation treat translation as a recreation of an original text with new materials relative to a genre criterion. So let's say I have a book, then I choose the genre that I'm going to translate it under, and then I recreate a book with new resources that has the same genre-specific purpose. Okay, so I could translate the same book as a book of poetry or a book of drama or a book of philosophy, but I have to choose the genre, and then that dictates how I'm supposed to use the target language in reconstructing. So when you think about things in terms of the linguistic framework, you expect these pairings of words and sentences across languages. It's all about linguistic meaning. Doesn't work. Doesn't work for various reasons. But the best explanation is, well, you're reconstructing. That's actually a yogic point, because you're engaging in yoga citta vritti nirodha. You're checking, you're controlling. You're not allowing the original to influence you. You're rather taking charge of that content and then using a yoga, a discipline like philosophy or chemistry or what have you, to determine what the import of that text is. And then you produce a translation that way. So I think it's that's how you do it successfully, if at all.
Very interesting. And then we have another question regarding your fruit salad analogy.
Yeah.
Can you further explain what you meant by that?
Absolutely. So there are two different kinds of categories. One are you could call kinds, and the other classes. So a kind is a category where the defining trait that groups everything together is shared by each of the things that are so grouped. So red would be a kind. So the category of red things, each red thing would display redness. Then you have class categories where you have a category, you have a criterion of group membership that's not shared by the constituents, like fruit salad. So the criterion of fruit salad is a collection of different pieces of fruits. It doesn't follow that every piece of fruit salad is a collection of different pieces of fruit. So you have one rule for the collection, and then it's not downward transmittive. So Hinduism is a class concept, not a kind concept. So some religions are kinds, like Christianity, right? Like, so everything Christian has to give priority to Jesus. Otherwise, you wouldn't call it Christian. Everything Muslim will have to give some type of priority to the Quran or Muhammad. But if you look at the time that the word Hinduism was used by the British to talk about South Asia, they meant something like everything indigenously South Asian, or South Asian no common founder. That's the way I translate. So if that's your idea of what Hinduism is, then anything could be Hindu. But when you look at that thing on its own, it might not have anything to do with Hinduism, right? So each of the options that fall under Hinduism, when you look at them on their own, they're standalone options. And the only reason that they got grouped together was because of colonialism, right? One of the things I point out is that if you really want to understand this tradition, you have to understand it in terms of its openness to dissent, which is just the opposite of understanding the Western tradition. So if you want to understand the Western tradition, you go back to the very beginnings with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. It's all about social conformity ends up being the major concern. In South Asia, nobody expected that, right? So if you didn't agree with the conventional values, you would go out and be a Shramana, like the Buddha, right? Or Mahavira, and then you would work on your own experimentation. You would try and figure things out yourself, and that was valued, right? So, which I think is remarkable. We should be living life that way, right? We should, as much as possible, be valuing this type of freedom to experiment philosophically and disagree with each other. That I think is also a yogic value, because it's about each one of our sovereignty, right? Like me being a yogi is not about me expecting everybody else to agree with me. Yes, I'll stop talking about that. I could go on and on about that.
Oh, that's wonderful. What I'm hearing is this very important role for questioning, for critique within these Indic traditions,
Right.
and to really encourage that kind of questioning within our own practice.
Absolutely. I guess the only clarification I want to add is that if we're really going to do it the Indic way, we would be okay with other disagreements. So what happens in the Westernized context is people will want to say, well, let's disagree about what yoga is about, right? As opposed to thinking, well, let's disagree and allow yoga to be a contribution to that disagreement. And the difference is in the Western context, when you say, well, let's disagree about what yoga is about, we're actually not ever allowing yoga to contribute to the disagreement. We're pretending like it's just whatever it is that we feel like it is. So I'd want to say that the questioning and critiquing should make room for these traditional options to contribute to the controversy. And then when we allow that, I feel like there's a lot for us to learn.
Yes, the key word I'm hearing is contribution to the controversy, which is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
Just because there's some other questions coming in, let me go ahead and ask.
Sure.
Stuart Gilchrist is asking, what direct action have you personally participated in? Occupy, BLM?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that when you appreciate that the kernel of that is using ahimsa as a tool against himsa, then there are lots of ways for us to do that without necessarily it being that dramatic. So I, for one, have focused on the less dramatic ways of doing this, and I do it for a few different reasons. I think there's the reality of being a racialized individual, where when you do participate in things, so for instance, I'll give you an example. I have a high school friend who participated in a direct action event close by home in defense of First Nations land defenders. And he's white, and he said he got a very polite phone call from the police explaining how sorry they were that they had to present him with some papers, and that could he please come down and sign them, and oh, this will be over in a couple of seconds. And whereas the First Nations individuals who were there, right, were experienced police violence. So I think it's a reality of our world that we live in a white supremacist political system, and so direct action has to take all sorts of different forms, especially appreciating that the consequences aren't going to be the same for all of us. So one way I do it is as a philosophy professor, I'm constantly dealing with people's anger at me. It's a daily event. It's a daily event, especially when I teach South Asian philosophy. I find if students are going to have a meltdown against me, they'll have it against me when I'm teaching South Asian philosophy. And one of the reasons it happens is because South Asian philosophy, especially yoga, points out that we have choices in things we pretend we don't have choices in, right? So a lot of people will want to pretend like the world is just the way it is. It has nothing to do with me. And yoga's like, no, 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 you're making all sorts of decisions that are supporting the status quo. And the question is, why is that the responsible way to deal with it? And I'm, and the results are often, they're professionally and personally difficult to deal with. I not only have to deal with them, I also have to deal with the repercussions that, like, if they decide to complain up the chain, the very reality that maybe something could happen to me in my employment if this goes awry. So I factor all of that in as my kind of daily direct act, my daily challenging of people who are complacent. So I guess it's a Socratic way. I don't plan on drinking any hemlock. I'm not interested in. The only other thing, I guess, the thing I want to say is that I think yoga, one of the things that yoga has taught me is that nobody has to be a martyr. And martyrdom is actually not part of yogic activism. So you should always think about yogic activism as something that you can succeed at by doing it all the time, right? And people who think of direct action as a tool or as a means to an end are not only not practicing yoga, but they're setting themselves up for disappointment. Because if they can't do it all the time, they're not going to win the battle, right? So whatever it is that you think is your mode of political engagement, it has to be something you can practice all the time. Because then, of course, you're going to win. You'll just won't fatigue, and they will, right? I think, and so when I look at a lot of attempts at activism as a kind of strategy to bring about ends, I think, oh, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because they're not practicing yoga. Yoga isn't a strategy to bring about an end. It's about you living your life as sovereign, right? So I'd like to encourage us all to think about activism as us working on our sovereignty and not allowing the status quo to be an obstacle to that, right? So then it can become rather undramatic, right? It's about all the ways in which we interact with each other.
Absolutely. And speaking of sovereignty, Dr. Chris Chappell has asked to please elaborate on the concept of being sovereign, The Argumentative Indian by Amartya Sen.
Yeah, I haven't read all of Sen, but I think that when I saw that title, I'm like, yeah, that is so South Asian. You don't sit around and just nod your head at what everybody else says. Everybody's got a view on every issue. I think, as a coming out as a philosophy professor, one of the things that I'm impressed with is that there's a difference between free speech and free thinking. And so when I think about sovereignty, I think about it not in terms of just the freedom to say whatever I want, because that often isn't free at all, but this real freedom to engage in exploring the possibilities, right? And that does have room for open debate. And certainly in the South Asian tradition, they did that. They just disagreed with each other all the time. So when I saw Sen, as I said, I haven't read the whole book, but I just skimmed it. It's a clever title, but it's very apt. I think it captures something about the tradition of people who thought that the way to interact with each other was to make a case for something controversial. That's how you interacted with people, right? Interacting with people wasn't about going to church and listening to a minister tell you what you had to believe. It was about going into public and then having a debate with someone you disagreed with. now there is, of course, this element of participating in sanghas and group commitments, but that only operates within a wider context in which people were free to choose, they were free to leave, they were free to change their mind. Philosophical freedom. I think we're missing that today.
That's really wonderful. I'm seeing that there's this incredible role for us to challenge one another and our egos through questioning through our sovereignty. And
absolutely.
That's wonderful. That is the yoga off the mat. And I see that there are many more questions coming in, but we're at time. I'm going to just ask one last question. We're going to go just a little bit over. We have by Melissa. She said, you mentioned that scholars should be teaching and sharing these practices and philosophies. Wouldn't this pose a challenge for diversity, inclusion, and accessibility due to socioeconomic barriers?
Oh, I see. Right.
Lending to the perpetuation of appropriation by those with greater means.
Right. So I think if what we're doing is genuinely sharing knowledge of yoga, which is knowledge of how we can work on being sovereign, then it doesn't matter who you learn it from, because that will be the medicine for these systemic problems. What we get in yoga education frequently now isn't that, right? So what we get rather is this liberalism with dance moves. So I think if we can start to focus on what's basic in yoga, then what happens is the class and ethnic background in the individual stops being a criterion of whether we should pay attention to them. But under white supremacy in the Western tradition, that's what gives someone credibility, right? So if we really want to get rid of this systemic discrimination, we need a philosophical shift. And you're right, in the short term, it might very well be people who have, but I think not necessarily, and I guess this is the last thing I want to say, real yogic knowledge is not about privilege, right? You can be raised within a context of yoga, but not really engage with those ideas. I think I see that a lot with South Asian people. They're raised within a context where yogic ideas are available to them, but they don't engage with those. They don't make those the central parts of their life. They simply try and participate in a kind of cultural groupthink. I think this is a function of imperialism too. I write about that in my book on Hinduism. But really, really engaging with yoga means that you are always challenging the status quo for being arbitrary, right? And I think anybody who's going to teach yoga who has that approach is going to be helpful to everybody.